In 2023, I built what I hoped would be the vintage PC of my dreams. While the end result worked well, I found that it didn't quite hit the mark. So this time, let's see if I can get it closer to what I was looking for. I picked up a new motherboard off of eBay that I thought would do nicely, which came bundled with a CPU and RAM. It's an Intel 815 series board, which were pretty common in 1999. But on closer inspection, that's not great. The corrosion from capacitor leakage was so bad that even the retention clip for the CPU's heatsink was rusted. But what's crazy is that the seller had photos in the listing of this board working. Were they lying? Only one way to find out. The retro PC I built for myself would serve as a good testbed for this board. I built it around a Pentium 4, but for reasons we'll get to later, that motherboard won't be staying in there much longer. I freed the ATX power harness from the case so I could drape it over the side and connect to the 815 board, then attached a monitor and fired it up. And sure enough, it did indeed work. So while it's not cool that I was sold a motherboard with obviously leaking capacitors, at least I had good hope for repairing it. So let's get to work. I didn't want to just swap the caps, but also give the board an overall thorough cleaning, since the leaked electrolyte can often affect nearby circuitry and do weird things. After unclipping the heatsink, I found an interesting sticker on the CPU. Looks like a warranty void label applied by the company who built whatever system this board came out of. A name like Best Logic makes for difficult research due to how generic it is, so if you're familiar with them, let me know down in the comments. The CPU came out, and while the CMOS battery was likely dead, I popped it free too. I've gotten into the habit of cleaning PCBs before I do repair work on them, as it allows me to better see the extent of any damage. An ultrasonic cleaner would be ideal, but I don't have the space for one of those, so I've found a storage bin filled with isopropyl alcohol usually does the trick. An old toothbrush makes quick work of dislodging any residue, and when the board looked clean, I left it to dry overnight. After that, it was a straightforward task of desoldering the old caps, cleaning up the pads and areas between them I couldn't reach with the toothbrush, then soldering in the new parts. Some find this process tedious, especially when there's many caps involved like on this board, but others find it relaxing. A Celeron 733MHz CPU was included, but this being the internet, I'd get yelled at if I didn't replace it with a proper Pentium. A P3600 chip in this case. Personally, I don't have much of a problem with earlier Celerons, and in fact they can be a compelling option for a retro PC build. But that's a story we'll tackle in a future episode. In any event, a 600MHz chip better fits what I'm looking for, so next I needed a replacement for that rusty CPU cooler. This one should do nicely, a new old stock part from Antec. It's actually a model meant for AMD CPUs from that era, but works just as well on Socket 370 boards. I remember seeing these when they were new, but can't recall how well they worked. We'll find out soon enough. There was thermal paste factory applied on the bottom, but after a few decades I figured it would be best to replace it. I tidied up the wiring for the fan, then set the cooler in the correct orientation. Socket 370 was a bit asymmetrical, so if you installed the heatsink 180 degrees out, it wouldn't sit on the CPU quite right. I went with a dab of Arctic MX4 because I had it on hand, then the cooler just clipped into place. The RAM went back in next, followed by a new clock battery for good measure. Time to get it installed. I plan to keep most of the other parts already in the system, so this was really just a motherboard swap. I'm glad I had spent some time when I built this machine to keep the cabling reasonably neat, as it made getting the old board out a lot less annoying. I had hoped I could reuse the I/O shield, but in its infinite wisdom, Intel decided to tweak the port layout ever so slightly, so the network and USB ports wouldn't line up. Oh well, I popped out the old one and totally didn't struggle to put the new one in its place. All the standoffs in the case lined up so it was easy to screw in the 815 board, then it was a simple matter of connecting the cables, which were largely in the same places. There was one thing I wanted to add though, which required taking off the front bezel and twisting out one of the 5¼ drive bay covers. It's this, a Zalman fan controller, model ZM MFC1. This came from the days when options for quiet fans were limited and headers for them on motherboards were few, so it wasn't uncommon to see these in custom-built PCs from around the turn of the millennium. It took a little rerouting and the addition of an extension cable in order to get everything hooked up, but I was finally able to finish buttoning up the machine. I dropped my Sound Blaster Live back in, but left out the video card for now since the motherboard has graphics built in. And sure enough, it powered on and I could hop into the BIOS to confirm everything. It reported the CPU and RAM correctly and saw all the IDE devices. We should be in business. That fan controller not only matched the translucent aesthetic I was going for, but also fixed a problem I was having. I had previously installed LED lighting inside the front bezel, which wasn't a factory option. But it was normally much too bright, so putting it on one of the fan controller channels gave me a convenient way to adjust the intensity. I had put the case fan on another channel, but this didn't work out well as it caused the indicator LED to blink annoyingly, even with the fan at maximum speed. This controller was designed with the fans from the 90s in mind, instead of modern high-efficiency ones, so it couldn't handle the low current draw. I ended up plugging the fan back into the motherboard. I went to reinstall Windows 98 and at first everything went as one would expect. I previously had XP on this hard drive, so I let the setup program format it back to FAT32. But when it started to copy the files to the hard drive, it popped up with a message about a cab file error. I've had good luck with this install disk before, and while it looked clean, I burned another one anyway. But it threw the same error too. My next suspicion was the hard drive. I had installed a 60GB IBM DeskStar, a model which had gained an unfortunate reputation as being unreliable back in its day. Maybe it finally decided to fail on me, so I swapped it for an IDE to SD card adapter that I knew worked. Except then the computer wouldn't boot at all. It powered on, but I'd get nothing on screen. A check of the voltages showed they were just fine, so it wasn't a power supply problem. Maybe the SD card adapter failed, so I dug out another mechanical drive, a 40GB Samsung SpinPoint. But still, no change. On a hunch, I tried pulling the clock battery, and strangely, that seemed to fix it. What was going on? This time I copied the setup files from the CD to the hard drive first, and that completed without any errors. But in the Windows installer, it again failed with the same message about a bad cab file, this time at a different point in the process. I knew the CD-ROM drive was working fine, so I focused on it being a motherboard problem. I tried swapping the CPU back to the Celeron it came with, thinking that maybe it was some weird incompatibility, but that made no difference. I stuck a spare stick of RAM in the machine to rule that out, and same thing. There was clearly something weirdly wrong with the motherboard itself, but I had no idea what. I was lucky in that a viewer named Nick from Seattle reached out to offer a Socket 370 board, which happened to look very familiar. It also has an Intel 815 chipset and was in excellent condition, which was a relief. So with nothing to lose, I pulled the board out of the system, swapped the CPU and RAM, then installed the new one. And yeah, that totally fixed it. Windows 98 installed without a hitch, and I could load the driver to add USB mass storage support so I could copy files from a flash drive for convenience. Turns out the new motherboard is an OEM unit, as when the computer boots up, it shows a gateway splash screen. If you have an idea about how to remove this, let me know. There's also no onboard audio, which is totally fine since I have the Sound Blaster card, but it's also missing built-in Ethernet and 2 more USB ports, which leaves a couple of empty spots in the I/O shield. None of these things really bother me, yet I'm left with this strange feeling like the computer isn't quite complete. Memory can be a fickle thing. I remember building computers very similar to this one, and even using this exact same case back in the late 90s and early 2000s. All the parts inside this one should be hitting the mark for peak nostalgia, but somehow they're not. That's why I downgraded the machine from a Pentium 4 to a P3 to begin with. It never felt right the way I had originally built it. But it still doesn't feel right, and I'm not sure why. Maybe it's missing something, or one of the components isn't the right one to trigger the memory I'm after. I'll keep tinkering with this computer and hopefully I'll figure it out. There's also the question of what the deal is with the motherboard I had bought. It'll certainly need more troubleshooting, but I'm keeping it, along with the Pentium 4 board it tried to replace. This also leaves me without a P4 system in my collection. But that's something I have plans to rectify in due time. If you liked the video, I'd appreciate a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. Here's another episode you should check out, and as always, thanks for watching.